Hello and welcome to this brand new series titled Research InSightS Live. This first episode will be talking about climate and the environment. And when it comes to that matter, we are at a true turning point in history, both in terms of the challenge and the urgency that has reached a total boiling point, but also in terms of alternatives to our current system and our current thinking. I want to shortly introduce who's here with me in the studio today. Here on my left, we have Lorenzo Pellegrini. I should say Dr. Lorenzo.
Lorenzo Pellegrini is
Yeah,
fine. Thanks,
okay.
Lynn.
Lorenzo, you're Associate Professor of Economics of Environment and Development at ISS, and I'm very happy to see you here again.
Thank you very much, and thanks everybody who's watching this.
Yeah, thank you. Lorenzo, can you maybe, so that we're all on the same page here, can you give a very brief description of the All Eyes on the Amazon project, what it's about, and maybe also your role as researchers in it?
Yes, it's, as you say, the collaboration among many institutions, global and also here from the Netherlands. Most prominently, of course, HIVUS and Greenpeace, who are leading the project. But then we have a number of partners from the field. We have both universities in Ecuador, like the Universidad San Francisco de Quito, and then we have indigenous federations, social movements from the countries themselves.
So it's a lot of different parties coming together to
see what happens in the Amazon. So the project is called All Eyes on the Amazon. And it is a project with many activities to collect information and to manage and spread the information about what happens. So we have these partners that are, for example, indigenous people living in the Ecuadorian Amazon. Just since we have Maria here, let's keep it to the example of Ecuador. They know very well what is happening in their environment. There is oil being extracted, there is deforestation, there is land use change. They know very well, and together with them, we develop systems to collect that information on these impacts that they see, on these changes that they see around them, so that they can...
The negative changes, the deforestation,
the impacts from oil extraction are like oil spills, broken pipelines, oil roads that enter into the forest.
Yeah.
And this information can be then managed by the communities themselves and spread and used for campaigning purposes, for basically all the purposes they like to use them for.
Right.
All Eyes on the Amazon, that's the name of the project.
Right.
And that gives also an idea. It's about looking, about seeing what happens in the Amazon.
There, so you can use it to create change and to stop the negative things from happening or escalating. Yeah. Before we dive more into the content, I want to ask you, Lorenzo, because you've been to the Amazon so many times, you really give your work hard to it. What do you feel when you think about it? How do you connect to it?
Well,
to that mighty rainforest.
Yeah, so it's once you stop and think back, I've been going to the Amazon for 12 years. It started really by chance with the former student of ISS that had some activities there, an NGO. And then, well, I fell in love with the place, with the people, and we have these partners that we have relationships with that we cultivated over time. And what you feel when you're in the Amazon is just the overwhelming power of nature, and also the concern about what some humans, some economic agents are doing to nature.
Yeah, so it's a combination of this admiration and being like, wow, we're such a small creature in this mighty forest, and the concern of what that small creature is, or some of us are actually.
Yeah, in fact, we focus in areas where there are problems. So when we think, you'd say Amazon, often people have this vast, pristine forest in mind. And the first thing that comes to mind for me is a deforested area or an oil spill.
Yeah.
That's what we see very often. These are the places where we think most of the action should be about stopping these processes that are the manifestation of extractive industries, extractive activities.
Yeah, I think it's good to have a look because Lorenzo, you've been working on a documentary about the project and to get a feel of what we are really talking about here.
Cuando empezó la operación petrolera en la Amazonía ecuatoriana, no teníamos conocimiento de qué podía pasar a un futuro.
Hay una colección de gas que no se soporta.
Eso es un impacto territorial y después un impacto social y cultural.
Al principio se resaltaba como un aporte importante para el desarrollo humano, pero después de un proceso todo cambió.
Todo petróleo.
Es un área explotada.
No podemos cultivar.
Es un área deforestada.
No hay contaminación, mire, yo tengo aquí la fotografía.
Es un área súper contaminada.
Exposed to all these problems is probably the beginning of finding a solution.
Wow. Lorenzo, I had the opportunity to watch the full documentary. I learned quite a lot of new things about it. I also learned a new word, solastalgia. Solastalgia, I'd never heard it before. What does it mean?
Yes, it's the feeling of missing home while you are at home. And it's a condition that is common in places where the environment is being heavily deteriorated. So the people who live around that environment or in that environment, that depend on that environment for their livelihoods, but also for their mental well-being, they have a sense of loss, of longing for home while they are still at home physically.
Yeah, what a heartbreaking thought. You long for home, you're in your home, but it's being destroyed. Yeah.
It's a powerful concept that
It is,
environmental psychologists have been coming up to describe something that we knew already about.
Yeah, and that
I
takes
think
place in many places around the world, obviously. Yeah.
obviously many places.
Yeah.
And in these places in particular, you have the contrast between nature that can be so overpowering just next door, and then these environmental impacts of these industries just a few kilometers down the line.
Yeah. Another insight that I had was that these oil spills that are happening, that you saw in the trailer as well, they're actually not accidental. It's not like, oops, it happened again, right?
Yes, we can talk about industrial accidents, but in fact, these are accidents that can be predicted, and most of them could be avoided if you did maintenance, if you did invest in safety, and these investments are not happening because they don't improve the baseline of the companies that are making profits out of extracting these resources.
Right, so there's very minimal investment in upkeeping the pipings and everything, so it can just easily break and spill.
I mean, these kind of impacts are everywhere where there is oil extraction.
Yeah.
But in these locations in particular, of course, the companies also take shortcuts. And the problems are even larger because they are surrounded by people that depend really on the environment for their livelihoods.
Yeah.
I mean, they depend for their water sources on the environment. They depend for their farming activities also, as we saw there, those people standing next to a gas flaring site. They have their farm there.
Very, very direct.
So they really
impact,
depend on that environment.
Yeah. And the last thing I wanted to highlight that I learned was that actually the main product of the oil industry is not oil, it's waste. Can you briefly say something about that?
Yes, the oil doesn't come out, of course, refined from the soil. What comes out is a mixture of gas, oil, and waters. And the main product, in fact, is so-called formation waters. So these are waters that are dirty of hydrocarbons, heavy metals, in some cases also radioactive material.
Wow, yeah.
And till quite recently, meaning just a little over 10 years ago, these formation waters in many countries in the Amazon, in many operations, were just dispersed in the environment, creating huge impacts.
Yeah.
And of course, essentially the problem of the oil industry is not only that by combustion, by burning the fossil fuels that are extracted, you create environmental problems. That is the problem of climate change, of course, a huge issue.
Yeah.
But there are all the local impacts that just add up to this global
in the
effect.
documentary, it said for every barrel of oil, there's 3 barrels of wastewater that go into the environment.
With huge variability.
Yeah,
so
of
on
course,
the average, globally, it's 3 barrels. But in fact,
you're a good researcher to be precise about this. Yeah.
as it happens in the Amazon, they have low quality oil, and in these locations also oil that has been extracted for a long time. So in fact, there is less oil per barrel of wastewater.
Yeah.
So the ratio is even higher.
Yeah.
You get more wastewater per barrel of oil.
I want to round off this conversation about the Amazon with questions from the audience. Thank you for joining in the conversation. I have a question from Eva, I hope I say your name correctly, for Lorenzo. And she's asking, are there also individuals or groups in the Amazon who actually welcome the oil companies, despite the pollution, despite the environmental transformation, that maybe see it as like an opportunity for development?
And the answer is, of course, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, we see also in the communities that are at the receiving end of this system, where most of the impacts are. You ask, what are the impacts for you? Clearly, they have a negative view of the oil industry, of the mining industry. And then if you ask, how do they envision the future? They are in dire straits of thinking of a future that is different. So in fact, with Murat, we developed this, talking about Maria's paradox, where Maria is somebody we actually met, and she expressed really concerns about the impacts of the oil industry in her community, in her family. And then we asked the question, would you be in favor or oppose the drilling of new oil wells around your community? And she were in favor.
Despite all the destruction.
Despite this, but so our point is to question the structures that make such a choice.
She's in favor because
there is no alternative.
There's no alternative.
So she's with the shoulders against the wall, and then chooses for yet more of the activities that created the problems.
Right.
So in fact, when
but
we
it's
think,
not a real choice in a way.
Exactly, it's not a real choice. There are structures that constrain our choice, and what is very important is to think also about the transition in these places that have been affected so long by the oil industry or by the mining industry or by deforestation, extractive activities. We have to
just
think
shows
about
that it's such a structural
stopping the
change,
activities is part of it, but then there is also creating alternatives for these people.
Yeah. Another question to you, Lorenzo. Can we already watch the documentary? A question from Eva. And another question from her is, where can we find more information on this that you were talking about?
So there is a website of the project, All Eyes on the Amazon, with all sorts of information in writing and videos, etc. Of course, we are academics. We wrote lots of articles about this, so you can look up Murat Arcel, Lorenzo Pellegrini on Google Scholar or wherever you like to look for.
Yeah, and there's also a Research InSightS website. If you go to the ISS.nl website, then you find a section called Research InSightS, and there you find all the research projects that we're talking about today.
And in fact, there is a website also about this. There is a page about these events, so from there you can trace us.
Yeah.
And about the documentary, it has been shown in 14 festivals, including festivals in Latin America. It has received several prizes.
Nice.
And there are currently negotiations with networks to distribute it.
Great.
If they break down, we will just distribute it through the usual channels like YouTube, etc. But right now you can, of course, watch the trailer, and soon it should be available one way or the other.
Nice, thank you. A last question before we go to our next speaker. I think we've heard so much so far. We've heard a lot of, a lot of challenges, a lot of things that we need to look at and see that it's structurally wrong, and we need to rethink and reframe how we do things and how we organize. But I want to, look at see if we can move forward, look into the future, look at alternatives, look at like ways to change. And maybe it's good to start at that point of extracting, because we've been talking a lot about extracting, and of oil, of rare earth elements, etc. Lorenzo, I think that from what I gather, you strongly feel that we need to stop extracting, especially when it comes to oil, right? And find ways to keep it in the ground. There was also a question from the audience about unburnable fossil fuels. That was it you or Murat who wrote about that?
We wrote together.
Wrote it together. So maybe like keeping it in the ground. What is that unburnable fossil fuels?
Well, it's the realization that there are limits. So we live in a global society nested within global capitalism, where permanent growth seems possible, and we have to realize that we have limits. One of these limits is associated with the so-called carbon budget.
Yeah.
So this amount of carbon dioxide that can be emitted without running the risk of heating the global atmosphere of more than 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, if compared to pre-industrial times. And if we take the carbon budget seriously and we look at fossil fuels, a large share of existing reserves of fossil fuels cannot be extracted.
Cannot just stay in the ground.
They go beyond that limit.
Yeah, exactly.
So these are so-called unburnable fossil fuels.
Yeah.
Fossil fuels that we know that exist. In some cases, there are property
but maybe
rights.
in the mines of big oil, they're not unburnable.
No, in the minds of, in the plans, in the forecasts of oil companies, they will extract more and more. Projections are that more and more is being extracted. And in fact, if you take all the majors, they invest much more in exploring and increasing extraction capacity if compared to their investments in the much touted investments in renewable energy.
Yeah. Okay, so for fossil fuels, we can say a large part of it just needs to be unburnable. You cannot touch it anymore. Lorenzo, is it gradual change or is it systems overhaul?
I think what I have in mind is a question that looms large, and that's the question of the politics of this.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking about, we can look at us here, what can we do? What can we do as consumers, for example? What can we do through the courts? And I think what can we do as citizens?
Yeah.
How can we mobilize? How can we get together? How can we fight for the change that is necessary? I mean, even a simple question like, am I going with the bicycle or am I going by car? We are here in Amsterdam. If you look at those videos from the 70s, it's incredible how Amsterdam was full of cars. Now we can choose effectively of going by car or going by bicycle, because people since the 70s have been struggling.
Yeah.
They've been fighting for the right of space, for the right of cycling safely. And that's, I think, really the question that looms large. What do we do as citizens? How do we mobilize? How do we break the structural violence that is embedded in these inequality structures that Murat also was mentioning?
Yeah.